How's it going, everybody? Welcome to the second video in this series. Last time we took a look at Mirage, and today we're looking at the most expensive cards in the Weatherlight expansion. So Weatherlight was directly after Mirage. It's the second in the block of 3 sets. Weatherlight was released in June 1997 and consists of 167 cards. So let's just get right into it. Dust off your old Magic collections and hope that you have some of these cards. Today we're looking at the ones with the little book symbol in the side right here. So, at number 10 on our list, we have Goblin Bomb. A lot of text on this card, but why don't I read it for you. During your upkeep, you may choose to flip a coin. Target opponent calls heads or tails while the coin is in the air. If the flip ends up in your favor, put a fuse counter on Goblin Bomb. Otherwise, remove a fuse counter from Goblin Bomb. And then you can remove 5 fuse counters from Goblin Bomb and sacrifice it to deal 20 damage to target player. So, in simplified terms, you flip a coin every turn. If you win the flip, it gets a fuse counter. If you lose, it removes a fuse counter. And if it ever gets to 5 fuse counters, then you can hit your opponent in the face for 20 damage. So it's a very chaotic card and very unreliable, I would say. I mean, there's a chance you could go until turn 20 and still not have been able to activate Goblin Bomb. But in the past 8-10 years or so, there have been some mechanics released which have made this card a lot better. The first is Proliferate, which was from Scars of Mirrodin, and is an effect that allows you to choose any number of permanents you control and put an additional counter of any types of counters that it has. So a card called Contagion Engine has an ability that you can pay for and tap it to proliferate and then proliferate again, so you essentially proliferate twice. And if you have at least 1 fuse counter on Goblin Bomb, then you're only going to need to activate Contagion Engine twice to get up to 5 counters and destroy your opponent. Well, hopefully, if they didn't get any life during the game. And Skyship Plunder is a newer card from Either Revolt, I believe. It's a 2/1 flying, and also just allows you to tick up a counter on a permanent you control once per turn. Another interesting thing, too, is that the Goblin Bomb effect doesn't have to be used every turn. It's a you may effect, so once you get 1 fuse counter on it, you can just stop flipping coins. And the card costs about $7.50 to the making of this video. Not bad. Another note, these prices are in US dollars and are for cards in near mint to mint condition. So unfortunately, all the old riffle-shuffled, destroyed cards thrown into a shoebox, held together with rubber bands, probably aren't worth as much as these, but they still will be worth a little bit, so. Gemstone Mine is number 9 on the list. This is, I think, the only card on the list that's not on the reserve list, and it is an uncommon, which is pretty sweet. So if you have a lot of Weatherlight cards, chances are you might have multiple copies of this. Gemstone Mine is a land. When it comes into play, put 3 mining counters on it, and you can tap and remove a mining counter from it to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. And if there are no mining counters left on it, then you sacrifice it. So, one of the reasons this card is so good is because it's a 5-color land that doesn't come into play tapped. From what I've been reading, it sounds like this is just another gold land for Dredge to use, and it's good in decks that, and especially in formats that have a really fast tempo. If you're running a deck and it's expecting to have won the game by the time that the counters are all removed from Gemstone Mine, then it doesn't really matter if if it's a limited use card, right? So another interaction with this card, which is very positive, is Life from the Loam. So sorcery with Dredge that allows you to return lands from your graveyard to your hand. So if it does run out of counters, you can always fetch it back up and replay it. And this card will cost you about $11 as of the making of this video. At number 8, another reserve list rare. By the way, you can tell the cards are reserve list rares because I put a little star here. This is a very, very confusing card. So it's going to take me a bit to explain how this card works. It's called Mana Web. It's a 3-mana artifact. And the effect that it has is whenever a land an opponent controls is tapped for mana, tap all lands that player controls that could produce any type of mana that that land could produce. So let's just walk through this together. I'm going to show you with examples kind of how this works. Let's say you have a land like Brushland, which can tap for 1 colorless, or it can tap for a white, or it can tap for a green. No matter which mode you use, all your lands, or all the lands that your opponent controls that could tap for any of these colors, are also going to get tapped due to the card's effects. And of course, what you'd probably do is tap the lands in response for mana. It's not like it's actually going to get rid of all your opponent's mana, by just letting them tap 1 per turn. It's not that overpowered, but what it would let you do is force them to use all the mana during a certain phase. They have to tap out in response to the ability. I got some cards just for example, because this is one of these cards where you have to really play with it to see how good it is and how it is a little bit better than it seems at first glance. So let's say you have 2 mountains. Okay, so you have 2 mountains, and you have 2 plains, and you have 2 lands that tap for either red or white, and a multicolored land that taps for mana of any color. If you're the opponent and you tap 1 mountain, oh, there we go. What's going to happen is the ability is going to go on the stack, and it's going to tap all 5 of these lands, except for the 2 plains that only tap for white. But if you were to go and tap all those lands in response for mana, then the dual lands that could tap for both colors of mana, because they can also tap for white, even if you tap them for red, would also tap the plains. So I think that a lot of times you are going to end up being able to tap all of your opponent's lands in a single swipe, unless they're willing to tap for like 1 or 2 mana just to have a couple more mana open. But I think for the most part, it's really going to shut down decks that want to play spells during your turn, and decks with a lot of counter spells, and it's going to prevent them from being able to play creatures on their turn and to counter your stuff. So one of the most popular combos that I was reading about was Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth, which is simply a land that makes all lands in play swamps. So now all lands tap for black. So now no matter which land your opponents tap, all their other ones are going to get tapped. Cards that make your opponents tap mana at weird times are also really effective because mana drains at the ends of phases and steps. So cards like Ghostly Prison and Propaganda make your opponents pay 2 mana every time they attack. And with Urborg in play, this essentially means that they have to choose between either attacking you or playing a creature or an artifact, enchantment, etc. stuff on their main phase, which is pretty devastating. It's a pretty good way to control the opponents. Some more cards that you can use are Koskan Falls, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, and Baird, Steward of Argive from Dominaria. So this is just an option in black and an option that's also a creature, which could be pretty effective just to make your opponents, once again, have to pay mana to attack you. And Mana Web just increases the effectiveness of all these cards, essentially. Magus of the Tabernacle and Pendril Mist both have the same ability, which makes all creatures have an upkeep cost of 1. So essentially everybody has to pay 1 mana on their upkeep or their creatures are sacrificed, which is really, really good if you have Mana Webs, and especially with Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth, because that means that your opponents are going to have to choose between keeping their creatures or sacrificing all their creatures just in order to play another creature, and then that creature is also going to have an upkeep cost. So it's really going to lock down your opponents, and it could definitely be really effective in a prison deck or a stacks deck. And the fact that it only affects your opponents too is really awesome about Mana Web, that it doesn't affect you as well. Kataki War's Wage is another card that gives an upkeep cost to artifacts, so just another cool synergy. And of course the Tabernacle of Pendril Vale, but I think if you're spending $3,000 on a single card, you probably have nastier things to do than to combo with Mana Web. So, all that being said, I hope that all made sense, and this card only costs about $13 at the time of making this video, and I think it's a little bit undervalued, possibly because people don't understand exactly how powerful this card is. And just really how versatile it is, in my opinion. That's just my opinion, though. Feel free to disagree with me, of course. At number 7 on the list, another reserve list rare, we have Firestorm. So for 1 red mana, it's an instant. You get to choose and discard X cards from your hand to deal X damage to each of X target creatures and or players. So I want to emphasize here, this isn't X damage divided among creatures and players. It's literally X damage to X creatures or players. So if you discard 3 cards, then you're going to deal 3 damage to 3 targets, so that's a total of 9 damage. And no, you can't do them all to the same target, so you can't just play it on turn 1, discard 6 cards, and deal 36 damage to 1 player. That'd be super overpowered. You have to pick different targets. But a few synergies, so it works really well with Chandra's Phoenix, which is a card that comes back to your hand whenever an opponent is dealt combat damage, whenever they're dealt damage by a red instant or sorcery you control. So you can essentially cast Firestorm is what it's called? Probably forgot. Yeah, I think Firestorm, discard Chandra's Phoenixes, and then by the time Firestorm resolves, deals damage to the opponent. If you chose them as one of your targets, then you return Chandra's Phoenixes to your hand. kind of just get negate the downside of the card that way. And then of course it combos with Madness cards as well. I mean, every card that has a discard effect combos with Madness. Essentially Madness just allows you to cast spells after they're discarded, and usually for a reduced cost. I think it would be really good with Madness cards that have X in their cost, or that are really mana intensive, because it only costs 1 red mana to cast, so you have all the rest of your mana free and open. So Absence Judgment allows you to deal X damage divided among more creatures and players, so just dealing a lot of direct damage to things from under the floorboards allows you to create X zombies. I think would both be interesting options. So the only downside of this card is that the value of X can't exceed the number of available legal targets, according to the Gatherer. And this is unfortunate because if you wanted to use it as a game finisher, or you needed to get the damage to a certain point in order to kill, say, all of your opponent's creatures, you might end up having to target yourself because you simply won't be allowed to cast it if there aren't enough targets on the battlefield, if there's not enough creatures and players. Shouldn't really be an issue if you're playing in a big multiplayer game of Commander, but it definitely does make it not quite as effective if you wanted to combo it with cards like Land Tax, or cards that make you draw a lot of cards to unleash a giant firestorm on your opponents, because you simply won't be allowed to if there aren't enough targets, and you might end up having to target yourself, which is quite unfortunate. But nonetheless, still an awesome card with a lot of really good uses, and costs about 15 bucks. So, yeah, not bad. Scorched Ruins is number 6 on this list, another reserve list rare. When it comes into play, you have to sacrifice 2 untapped lands, or sacrifice Scorched Ruins, and it is a land itself. So the reason that it has this huge drawback is because you can tap it for 4 colorless mana, which is pretty insane if you think about it, because it combos really well with anything that can untap a land. Crozan Restorer is a creature that can tap to untap a land, or if you have Threshold, can untap 3 lands. Candelabra of Tawnos type abilities, you can pay X mana and tap it to untap X target lands. Of course, Candelabra of Tawnos is like hundreds of dollars, so probably won't be using those, but nonetheless, the point is made. Unfortunately, you are putting all your eggs in one basket, and that's the biggest downside of this card, in my opinion. So you're going to become a huge target for your opponent's strip mines, wastelands, tectonic edges, ghost quarters, encroaching wastes, field of ruins, dust bowls, memorials to war, etc., etc., etc. And I found that in Commander, you seldom end up being able to keep that land for the whole game, which really sucks. But nonetheless, it's still an awesome card, and can be used for very good effects in combination with other cards. And costs about 15 bucks. So, same as the last card. And at number 5, we have Pendril Mists. So, has the same effect, I believe, as the Tabernacle at Pendril Vale, but of course is a lot more of a budget option for those who don't have $3,000 to spend on a single card. So for 3 colorless and 1 blue, a total casting cost of 4, it is an enchantment with the ability that each creature gains during your upkeep, pay 1 mana or sacrifice this creature. So obviously very, very effective in prison decks, in stacks decks, you know, decks where you're really wanting to control your opponent. And yeah, like I said, just a budget option. And it synergizes with the aforementioned Mana Web from the same set, which is kind of cool, making your opponents pay an upkeep cost. So once again, $15. So not too pricey, not too cheap either. But at number 4, another reserve list rare, we have Peacekeeper. So for 2 colorless and 1 white, 3 casting cost, it is a 1/1 creature with the ability that creatures can't attack. So that's a really powerful, really game-changing effect. The only downside is that during your upkeep, you have to pay 2 mana, or you have to sacrifice Peacekeeper. But in some ways, this is actually also kind of an upside, because there are occasions where you might get really ahead of your opponents and you wouldn't want this restriction anymore. And so at any time during your upkeep, you can just choose not to pay the cost, and then you can sacrifice it and attack your opponents. So that's, you know, it's good and bad, usually bad, but it does have an upside as well. As a comparison of the power level of this card, Moat, with a somewhat similar effect, although I mean it is a different card, granted. It says non-flying creatures can't attack, but it's an enchantment, which, you know, makes it avoid creature removal and board wipes and whatnot for the most part. But this card is a very, very expensive card. It's like $400 or something. Maybe even more. It might be like $700 now, actually. So you can see that this is a very powerful effect, and this provides a really good budget alternative. You know, once again, could be used in prison decks, stacks decks, and costs about 18 bucks as of the making of this video. Lotus Veil is number 3 on this list, another reserve list rare, and this one is very similar to Scorched Runes. So it's a land. When it comes into play, sacrifice 2 untapped lands or sacrifice Lotus Veil, and it taps for 3 mana of any one color. So this card is obviously a reference or a tribute of some sort to Black Lotus, hence the very similar effect and the similar name. And no, you can't play the land, tap the ability, and then not pay the costs and have it be sacrificed. Unfortunately, I think this card would be a lot more expensive if you could do that, but it is a replacement effect. It's been errated to say that it doesn't even come into play if you don't sacrifice the 2 lands, so you can't abuse it that way, but nonetheless, still an awesome card. Just like Scorched Ruins, it combos with any cards that untap lands. Here's a few more good examples. Argothian Elder is an elf that untaps 2 lands. Magus the Candelabra has basically the same effect as Candelabra of Tawnos, except on a creature. X mana to untap X lands, and doesn't cost hundreds of dollars, which is nice. Lotus Veil and Scorched Ruins also combo with cards like Crucible of Worlds and Ruminap Excavator, because they allow you to play lands from your graveyard, essentially to offset the drawback of the card and make it so you don't have card disadvantage if somebody is to kill Lotus Veil, which is nice. Flagstones of Trocair, once again another way to offset the disadvantage a little bit. A legendary land that lets you find a plains from your deck when it dies. And Land Tax, which is a good synergy with these cards because it allows you to find 3 basic lands from your deck if you have less lands than any opponent, and by playing Scorched Ruins or Lotus Veil, you're sacrificing 2 of your lands, so chances are, you know, there's a good chance you might have less lands than an opponent, which is going to help a lot to trigger cards like Land Tax. But, you know, obviously same issue, all your eggs in one basket. And, you know, I actually used to play Lotus Veil in my EDH deck for quite a while, but I ended up taking it out just because it just became such a target. It was like the moment I played it, people just couldn't resist cracking their Wasteland or their Strip Mine or whatever to kill my Lotus Veil, because it's like a 3-for-1, you know, it's just a no-brainer to do that if somebody plays Lotus Veil. So, I mean, this is just my opinion, but I tend to now just prefer the Ravnica bounce lands because instead of sacrificing a land, they just return it to your hands. You know, it's to each their own, it's just preference, and Lotus Veil is still definitely a really awesome card. Not to undermine the card at all. And it does cost around 20 bucks. So yeah, 20 bucks. What's that, like 5 current set booster packs? Yeah, that's pretty good. We're getting up there in costs. At number 2, another reserve list rare. Winding Canyons, another land. This one doesn't come into play tapped, which is great. You can tap it for 1 colorless mana, and it has the ability that you can pay 2 and tap it so that until the end of the turn, you can play creature cards whenever you could play instants. So it essentially lets you play creatures as though they had flash, which is really awesome in Commander in my opinion, because a lot of times, and like let's say you have a control deck, right, and you're not sure, there's so many players. Do you want to save up mana to counter a spell, or do you want to play a creature? You know, the game could change drastically by the time it gets to the end of the table. So this card allows you to essentially just wait with that decision and keep your counter magic open so that you can just play the creature at the end of the last person's turn, and keep your mana open the whole time, which is pretty sweet. Alchemist's Refuge is another similar card with a similar effect, another really good card, but it requires green and blue mana. The advantage is you can cast non-land cards instead of just creatures, which is pretty great, but once again the color restriction is pretty hefty, and Winding Canyons can be included in any deck, which is pretty cool, and I think most people are probably going to include both. You know, it's like, why not include both if you're playing Commander, if you think it's an effect worth including. Both of these cards are really, really effective with cards like Seaborn Muse and Awakening. Seaborn Muse has an ability that you can untap all permanents you control during each other player's untap step. Awakening, similar, at the beginning of each player's upkeep, untap all creatures and all lands. Excuse me, so essentially you can play turns during your opponent's turns. You know, you play, say, a creature on your turn, during the next person's turn they all untap, then you have Winding Canyons, then you can play another creature on your opponent's turn, etc. And if you have a way to also get card advantage, then this just becomes an insanely busted combo. Which, so like Captain Sisay is actually what I use it with. I have a Captain Sisay Commander deck, and she's a creature that can tap to find a legendary from your deck and put it into your hand. So essentially, the combo is that, say you have Seaborn Muse, Winding Canyons, you play a creature on your turn, next person's turn, untap, find a legendary, put it into your hand, use Winding Canyons to play the legendary, wait until the next person's turn, everything untaps again, find another legendary, play the legendary because it has flash. Like, it's absolutely bonkers. And Thrasios, trading here, Hero is another way, another commander that just gives you card advantage by paying mana basically to draw cards, so another really good way to use that sort of combo. Just allowing you to draw extra cards and then play them on your opponent's turn is very, very, very good. The ability isn't limited to creature cards in your hand, which is really cool, so you can cast cards from other zones, like the command zone. You can use it to play your general at instant speed, which is really neat. And a couple of things that I was reading about online, a couple of really good synergies are Rakdos, Lord of Riots, and Omnath. So Rakdos you can only play if an opponent lost life this turn, so if you're having trouble getting that to trigger, you're having trouble making your opponents lose life during your turn, then Winding Canyons is a great way to just wait until a different opponent has dealt damage and then flash it in. And then it also has the effect that your creature spells cost 1 colorless less to cast for each 1 life your opponent's lost. So once again, you can wait until some other opponent is damaged and then flash your creatures in for a really reduced cost, which is great. And I think Omnath is possibly one of the coolest uses that I read about for Commander anyway. Because, well, basically Omnath allows you to keep green mana in your mana pool instead of having it run out as steps and phases end, so you can amass a massive amount of mana, but of course susceptible to removal. If somebody destroys your Omnath, then all the mana just vaporizes at the end of the phase. But if you have Winding Canyons untapped, you can use some of that mana as soon as they kill Omnath to give Omnath flash, and then just recast it using the mana that you've saved up from Omnath. So I thought that was a really cool use, and to make Omnath decks a little bit more resilient. And this card will cost you about $22. So, yeah. And at number 1, the moment you've all been waiting for is Null Rod. Null Rod is incredibly good, but it's not anything flashy, right? So it's not some giant dragon, it's not... I mean, the art's a little bit flashy, granted, but the ability is very, very simple. So for 2 colorless mana, it's an artifact. Players can't play any artifact abilities requiring an activation cost. So in today's terms, our activated abilities of artifacts can't be activated. It's the exact same effect as Stony Silence, except that it's colorless mana, 2 colorless mana, which is great, so it can go in any deck. I mean, Stony Silence is a popular sideboard card for Modern. Unfortunately, Null Rod is not Modern legal, but once again, it's still so awesome because any deck can play it, not just decks that have access to white mana. So how much do you guess that Null Rod will cost if you don't know? Before I tell you, I'm just going to go over another really interesting thing about Null Rod and Stony Silence, which is that the effect also applies to mana abilities. This is a ruling on the Gatherer, so that means quite a few things, actually. That has quite a few implications. First of all, 6 out of 9 of the Power 9 are rendered completely useless, so your opponents can't tap, well, I guess you couldn't either, but Moxes, Black Lotuses are rendered useless. Soul Ring, Lion's Eye Diamond, Mox Diamond, Lotus Petal, all really nasty cards, are completely rendered useless by Null Rod. And in Commander, all your opponent's mana rocks, I mean yours too, but if you're playing Null Rod, you probably just wouldn't put any mana rocks in your deck. And I mean, a lot of players play with mana rocks in your deck. That's in their decks. That's just very, very common in Commander. So, Dreamstone Hedron, Commander Sphere, Felwar Stone, all those cards are completely shut down by Null Rod and Stony Silence, which is really cool. And lastly, for this mana abilities thing, is artifact lands. So this just completely hoses affinity decks. So you can imagine if all of your lands are artifact lands, somebody plays a Null Rod, now you can't tap any of your lands for mana. So you're like pretty much screwed. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure that's how it works, and is, very, very devastating against the right decks. And that also means that with Mycosynth Lattice, you can have a really scary combo. This was another... I think a really popular way to use Null Rod and Stony Silence is Mycosynth Lattice. So the important part about this artifact is that it has an ability that all permanents are artifacts in addition to their other types. So of course this includes lands, this includes creatures, enchantments, everything. So if you have this and Null Rod, then literally nothing can activate any abilities, including lands. So nobody can tap for any mana. So it's a complete lockout, basically, and you could make some really interesting deck around it, if you're creative, I'm not sure. But I just thought that was really crazy. I was like, whoa, it's like a complete lockdown, like, no questions. Sword of Fire and Ice, and Umezawa's Jitty. Am I pronouncing that right, or is it Jit? I never know how to say that. But anyway, all equipment is rendered useless by Null Rod, so it could be great if you have somebody in your playgroup that maybe has a nasty equipment commander deck or something like that, and they always give their creature Shroud and then equip it with a billion things. Null Rod will completely shut that off, which is really cool. And bada boom, 40 bucks for a Null Rod at the time of making this video. So yeah, what's that, like 10 booster packs, 10 current booster packs worth, you know, equivalent? What's that, like 1 Ultimate Masters booster pack? I'm just kidding. But yeah, so was there anything I missed? Definitely let me know in the comments. I'm always happy to hear. So like, was there any things that I forgot to touch on about why these cards are good and why they're worth what they're worth? Do you have any speculations on which cards you think are going to become worth more or less in the future? I definitely love to hear. You know, was there any cards that weren't on this list that you think might go up in value in the future or might become on this list? Are there any cards that you think are going to completely tank? Always love to hear your opinion. And yeah, that's about it for this video, I guess. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you guys in the next video. Oh, and I hope that you... just hit my eye with my necklace. I hope that you guys have some of the cards that were on this list if you had some of these old cards in your collection, and that you were surprised by their value. Alright, I'll see you in the next video.